Helmets on for safety. Welcome back to Random, and today I got to tell you folks, I am very glad to be here outside of Hill Aerospace in Roy, Utah, instead of, you know, Kentucky. Now, it's not that I don't like the bluegrass state, it's just that recently a rather large and intimidating Kentucky state trooper brutalized a ballistics dummy wearing a helmet very similar to mine, and I'm sure he meant no ill will, but all the same, I'd rather not risk suddenly being able to breathe through my forehead. So again, I'm glad to be here in Utah. Now, today's episode is all about this aircraft, the B-52, made by Boeing, otherwise known as the Buff, the big ugly fat fella, because YouTube doesn't like unfriendly words, and this is a family-friendly channel. Now, the B-52 started out in life as a prototype for the United States Air Force. They wanted something to carry massive amounts of ordnance a very long distance, okay? So back in 1952, Boeing set to work and they created a number of different variants that would ultimately become the aircraft we all know as the B-52. It is an 8-engine aircraft with swept wings. You can see them here. You'll see 2 engines per pylon, and there's 4 pylons on each side, so total of 8 engines. And if you look down here, you'll see the landing gear, which is an unusual, what's called quadricycle setup, with the first 2 trucks being able to turn to change the direction of the aircraft while it's on the ground. Now, you'll see over here the pogo sticks underneath the wings. Well, those also help support the weight of the aircraft while it's on the ground. And of course, they retract once you're done and up in the air. Now, what's really interesting about this aircraft is the wings. What they'll actually do is, under full fuel load, the wingtips, and you'll see again those wheels and the landing gear on the tips of the wings. Under a full load of fuel, the wingtips will be touching the ground with those wheels. And the ultimate range of this aircraft without aerial refueling is 8,800 miles, and that's a pretty long distance, right? So, pretty interesting aircraft once you see it, once you figure out its capabilities. Now, the aircraft itself used to use Pratt & Whitney engines. Let me get my editor's notes here. He's finally writing them again. Thank God for that. So the older engines are the Pratt & Whitney JT3 Delta and J57 turbojets. Now, if you remember back in a long time ago in episode 1 of Random, we talked about the differences between engines and jet engines, and the differences between a turbofan and a turbojet. Well, the B-52 still uses the older turbojets. The newer engines currently being installed on the B-52Js, which are supposed to be coming out soon, are from Rolls-Royce. Unfortunately, my editor, being the lazy bum, didn't write down exactly what type of engines they were, just that they're made by Rolls-Royce. Now, the newer engines, from what I'm told, can be tuned to run a little on the lean side, so they don't smoke quite so much as the old Pratt & Whitneys. Now, if you remember back in one of the earlier episodes, we talked about the stoichiometric balance and how jet engines, and really all internal combustion engines, are tuned to run a little on the rich side to keep everything cold, or cooler, I should say. Well, the Rolls-Royce engines use better materials in the hot sections of the engine, the turbine, the combustion chamber, and so on. And so they can tune the engines to run just a little bit leaner, so they're more efficient. They produce more power and they don't smoke quite so bad. The old engines, of course, are famous for belching out smoke as the aircraft is under load and making its way down the runway to lift off and accomplish its mission. Come on now. Now, the B-52, again, was initially constructed back in 1952, all the way up to 1962. And it is a subsonic, largely, aircraft with a payload of 70,000 pounds. Now, that can be conventional munitions, that can be nuclear warheads, that can be anything well, okay, I should say most things that the Air Force has in its inventory as far as weapons are concerned. Now, like I said, it has a range of 8,800 miles without aerial refueling. That's important because later models of the B-52 were all capable of aerial refueling for an operation that we'll get into here in just a little bit. Now, extensive use in NASA experimental R&D. That's right. The B-52, I should say 3 B-52s were contracted and or bought by NASA for use in various scientific endeavors. Chief among which was the X-plane program. Besides the Bell X-1, famous for Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier over Muroc Air Force Base in California, being dropped from a B-29, almost every other X-plane in the X-plane program in conjunction with NASA was dropped from a B-52. And believe it or not, the B-52 in question that helped with that program is still at Edwards Air Force Base today with the vacuum collar still attached. They use this incredible vacuum system that instead of using manual hooks or magnets or virtually anything else, they literally sucked the aircraft that they were going to drop from the B-52 up to the aircraft so they could take it up to altitude and then drop it from there. So that was a really cool piece of equipment. Unfortunately, due to the cost of the program and the cost of maintaining that particular aircraft, and more importantly that system, NASA shied away from it. Now, remember how I said the B-52 is subsonic largely? Well, no. Technically, this aircraft, as old as it is, as heavy as it is, as quote-unquote slow as it is capable of Mach 1. She don't like doing it, and once she gets back to the ground after going Mach 1, she needs a whole lot of inspections done. But yes, the B-52 can break Mach 1. And here's why that's important. Remember the X-plane program? Well, that wasn't the only experimental program the B-52 was associated with. A little while ago, back in the late 80s, very early 90s, NASA and the Air Force got together and on a project called the Pegasus. Now that was an airborne scramjet. Okay, now remember, back in one of the earlier episodes, I said that scramjets can only be activated and turned on past Mach 1. And well, wouldn't you know it, there was a need to drop the Pegasus at Mach 1 to kick off the scramjet. And wouldn't you know it, the only aircraft capable of not only carrying it but also releasing it at the altitude required was the B-52. So yes, the B-52 can go supersonic. Again, like I said, it just needs a whole host of inspections and maintenance done after that because, well, she was never really designed for that kind of speed. Now, if you can look down here along the sides, you'll see those variations in the skin. Now, believe it or not, those are on purpose. See, as the aircraft ages and as it pressurizes and depressurizes, you can get a good look at it here. You see those wrinkles in the skin? Those are by design. See, as the aircraft pressurizes and decompresses as it goes up and down in altitude, the aircraft will literally swell up. And well, you don't want breaches in the skin at altitude while you're pressurizing. So the aircraft will literally puff up like a beer can. And it'll stretch just a little bit so that it won't lose integrity. And it keeps the flight crew nice and happy because they won't be breathing a vacuum or less pressurized air at, we'll say the maximum altitude of this aircraft is 45,000 feet. With the new engines, that's what I can tell you, 45,000. Now, the operations that the aircraft were involved in, many. For the length of time this aircraft has been in use by the United States Air Force, it has participated in almost every single air campaign the U.S. Air Force has ever participated in. Some of which include Operation Linebackers 1 and 2, effectively ending the America's contributions and combat in the Vietnam War. Now, you could say, oh, the Vietnam War, the U.S. didn't actually win. Well, from a military standpoint, technically we did. Operation Linebacker 1 was basically a bombing campaign by fleets of B-52s flying into North Vietnam and bombing the bejesus out of everything, to the point where the civilian population was like, all right, we've had enough, no more fighting, we're done. Technically, that is a military victory. It's not a good military victory, but it did end the war, so kind of take that with a grain of salt. Operation Linebacker 2, of course, was in case Linebacker 1 failed. Linebacker 2 was only active for a couple of days, and then the North Vietnamese surrendered and ending the war. Now, Operation Chrome Dome, if that sounds familiar, I'll explain why. Operation Chrome Dome was B-52s flying around above the continental United States and Canada 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. These were B-52B or Cs capable of aerial refueling, so that they could be in the air all the time. So the B-52s would fly around, they'd wait till their tanks run nearly empty. KC-135 would come along, refuel them, and the B-52s would continue to fly until they needed more fuel, or in many cases, the air crews would need more food or some actual rest on the ground. Believe it or not, on the B-52, there is enough room for a couple of bunk beds for the crew to sleep while they're on really long missions, particularly Operation Chrome Dome. Now, believe it or not, Operation Chrome Dome inspired the Peter Sellers movie Dr. Strangelove. Now, that movie, of course, depicted what would have happened if the B-52 fleets participating in Operation Chrome Dome were given the go codes. Thankfully, that never happened. Let's see here. And of course, there was another operation that the B-52s were famous for participating in, Operation Rolling Thunder, which was also part of the Vietnam conflict. Now, Operation Rolling Thunder, why? That almost sounds like a car audio shop more than a military operation. Wonder why. Anyway, the B-52, of course, operated in Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and the Global War on Terror, and a few others. Now, if you see here on the chin of this particular model, or this particular aircraft, I should say, you see these two blisters here? These are for laser guided munitions that this aircraft is capable of dropping. Now, underneath, if you look past the landing gear, you'll see the very edge just along here of the bomb bay doors. Now, in the bomb bay, in most of this B-52s we have in the fleet today, it's what's called a rotary launcher. So they got this big gantry with several rows of munitions attached to a rotating assembly that when one set goes, the aircraft will spin the drum, and then the next set of bombs will go, and so on and so forth until the entire launcher is empty. And of course, there are hard points. You can see one right here for external bomb mounts. Just crazy amounts of ordnance that can be dropped from this particular aircraft. And again, with the range that this aircraft is capable of, the aerial refueling, its weapons payload, it's theorized that the B-52 will continue operation well into 2050. With modern materials and modern engines and better avionics, that's a real possibility. Now, there's a lot of stuff that unfortunately my editor and I can't talk about on this aircraft, so we'll just have to leave it at that. So yeah, the B-52, what a machine. All right, well, it's getting kind of chilly out here. I'm going to go inside and check out some other planes. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe. And at the beginning of the episode, I'm reasonably sure my editor is making fun of me and probably posting a link to the video in question from that gentleman in Kentucky. Anyway, thank you for joining us today, and as always, keep it random.